Welcome to Jason Sports Detroit Lions News Podcast. This is the Jason Sports with the Detroit Lions News Podcast. So if you are an NFL fan, a Lions fan, subscribe to the channel. You're going to get all your Detroit Lions news here on Jason Sports. But let's talk about the Detroit Lions. Today was the availability for Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell. And usually around this time, you really don't expect much from these press conferences because if you're going to be totally honest with each other, usually these press conferences are a little bit out to lunch. Usually when you talk about these press conferences, they're kind of not in absolutes. And when you talk about general managers and coaches talking at the combine, they're basically just saying, Let's get this interview, this media availability over with," and they're not going to be giving you any tea. So when Brad Holmes was asked today about the potential of adding a premier pass rusher to the Detroit Lions, this is what he said. He said, "These guys are hard to acquire. It's hard to keep them financially. We have one that's due for an extension, and we've already seen kind of gotten to the planning stages about him already." Holmes said about Aiden Hutchinson. So when you talk about adding another one, it's like, well, all right, can you financially add another one because you want to add the other one on top of everything else you have, and that's what makes it tough. And what Brett Holmes, everything Brett Holmes is saying, he's not wrong on it. Whatever Brett Holmes is saying, he's obviously got a plan for it. You know, a lot of people, especially in the fan bases in the NFL, they always stick to this narrative where they say, "Well, he should be able to go get this guy. You know, you got to go get this guy." Why do you got to go get this guy? That's some of the things that happen in the NFL. And when we're talking about Brad Holmes, obviously last year left a sour taste in a lot of Detroit Lions fans' mouth, and it was just a terrible time for the Detroit Lions because they lost in a game that they shouldn't have lost to. They had a bunch of injuries. They had 17 players on the IR, and they're missing a big host of them. And when Brad Holmes talks about signing other people, he's specifically mentioning a guy like Kirby Joseph. Do you want to sign a guy like Kirby Joseph, or do you not want to sign a guy like Kirby Joseph? And if you do want to sign a guy like Kirby Joseph, you can't have two pass rushers taking up that much money. You just can't. I mean, you could finagle it in, but it's going to take a lot of work, and it's got to take two to tango. And today, Andrew Berry of the Browns said that he is not trading Myles Garrett. And let's be honest, if the Browns do not want to trade Myles Garrett, they don't have to trade Myles Garrett. Even though he said, "I want to request a trade from the Cleveland Browns," it doesn't mean that the Cleveland Browns have to honor his trade request because they're looking to get the most out of what they can get for Myles Garrett. So if no one is offering them that, they're not going to give a deal for a guy like Myles Garrett. It's just not going to happen. So when Brad Holmes is saying what he's saying, "Look, we probably won't get that guy because can you financially add another one because you want to add the other one on top of everything else you have?" He's specifically talking about Kirby Joseph. He's specifically talking about some of the guys that are due extensions down the line. Hutchinson is due an extension. And you look around the NFL, there's not many teams that have high payroll dual defensive ends, and I think the Chargers were one of them with Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa. And did that really work out? No. You know, people bring up the Philadelphia Eagles this year. Not one of them was making over 9.5, $8.5 million. So that's just where this thing is going. When a lot of people talk about Brad Holmes and they talk about this Lions team, that they need to add a critical player, that they need to add this superstar defensive end, or else they're not going to ever win a Super Bowl. Or they're not going to go to the pendulum if they don't add these guys. It's a broad take. It's a kind of a sad take because the Detroit Lions have every opportunity to do what they're supposed to do. But the reality of the situation is they have constraints that they need to work with. They have players that they want to extend on their own, and they're going to have to eventually make this decision who they're not going to extend. And when you're Brad Holmes and you're thinking about all these possible extensions, there's probably a part in Brad Holmes' mind where he says there's no way that we can afford a guy like Myles Garrett. Now, obviously, if you crunch the cap numbers, you could potentially do it. But going into next year, the cap is kind of scarce for Detroit. But the cap's going to continue to rise, and every year it continues to rise in the NFL. But when we look at what Brad Holmes is trying to protect this franchise from, is where you get in a position where you are put to the test because you can't sign this guy. You're making cap casualties. You're kind of, you know, retooling as you're going. And that's just not what Brad Holmes is going to try to do. I mean, you look at what the LA Rams did in LA. They did the whole we're gonna after those draft picks, and then next thing you know, they drafted all the players that they drafted, like Kobe Turner, like Byron Young, like Brandon Fisk, and these are guys that are going to be with them for a while. So it just goes to tell you, like, there's multiple ways to build a team, and just because Brett Holmes doesn't go out and he doesn't trade for Myles Garrett or Max Crosby or Trey Hendrickson, doesn't mean that he's not improving the roster. Like a lot of people, they think, oh, if he doesn't get Myles Garrett, it means that he's not improving the roster. That's just total fallacy. Obviously, he has to make better moves. Like the Marcus Davenport one, I think everyone, myself included, was a little bit like, why are we getting this guy? He's always hurt. He's always hurt. But Brad Holmes tried to take a stab at it because there's good upside there, and it didn't work out. But he didn't know the rest of the team would just fall by the wayside. But to be 12-5, to be the record that you were this year with the amount of injuries that you had, and to still get the number one seed tells you how much talent is on this roster right now. And it's just a couple of pieces, like getting back Hutch, getting back McNeil. Obviously, they're not going to be, starting the year with the Lions. Obviously, Lee McNeil's not going to be starting the year with the Lions. He'll probably begin on the pup list or something like that. But Brad Holmes sees this team as a team that could potentially be a Super Bowl champion. And the way that they played last year with all the injuries that they had, there's no doubt that with what Brad Holmes is trying to say, like this team can be really good next year. They just have to get the right players, and they have to get obviously some luck on the health portion because they just had bad luck last year. But to be the record that they were with the amount of injuries they had, and then you think about the players that they're going to be, welcoming back this year, they're in a good spot. So if they don't get Myles Garrett, okay, fine. I get it. I understand it. But if they do get Myles Garrett, it doesn't mean it's a foregone conclusion. Obviously, there's things that Brett Holmes is thinking about on the ulterior motive side. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Is this kind of like a cat and mouse game where Brad Holmes says one thing and he does another? We see that all the time, especially with a guy like CVY in Detroit. But we'll see what happens this year. Obviously, free agency is coming up. Obviously, there's going to be contract extensions being given out. And whenever something breaks, you can expect to hear something on JC Sports, Detroit Lions News podcast, right here on JC Sports. So stick around, subscribe. We'll appreciate it. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next video. We talk more Detroit Lions football here on JC Sports.